Hi, Chris Yoke from Yoke Pen Company. Today I'm going to talk a moment about oblique flange geometry and engineering behind the pens. There's lots and lots and lots of new people that are making pens both on a commercial basis and then as well as a individual craftsman basis. And I've seen some really good ones, and I've also seen some really bad ones. So I wanted to go over a few points to help those that are making pens out, not only to help those, but to help the end user, which is going to have the pen in their hands. Especially if they're new and they're not familiar with an oblique and how it works. It is a tool, and it's got to function as a tool primarily. So what I wanted to cover is, we'll start with one thing. With a pen, okay, there's all kinds of customs now. Pretty is the easiest thing to do in the world. That just takes a little bit of time. You can have the prettiest, most beautiful holder you've ever seen, but if this flange geometry and the engineering is not sound behind that pen, it's completely useless at that point, and you're not helping anyone out other than yourself by, lining your wallet with a sale. And I don't think that that's anyone's intention. It's just the fact that they don't understand. So I'm hoping that this will help people understand. Everyone starts off, and we'll start off. I'll just tell you what I got here, and I got something for a little bit from everybody, just so I'm not picking on anybody. And before I start, I have issue with this pen holder, and we'll get to that in a second. But everybody knows that I have no issues with these. Whatever, I'm just grabbing. This is from John Neal, and this is from Paper and Ink Arts. I'm doing this fairly. I have no issue with these. They're both properly working pens. There's nothing absolutely. I'm going to use these as examples to show what would be off. And we'll start with this over here is the Speedball Oblique. And this is why it's not helpful. I recently saw someone point this out in a post, and that prompted me to do this video. If you look, that nib should be lined up. Let me bring this up closer to center axis. And if you look at this, what's happening is that nib is hanging way to the left. There's no way. This is a G nib, it's the #1 selling nib in the world right now. The different G series. It's a longer nib than typical, and because it's hanging way off to the right, that's not going to help anyone write. That's going to impede their writing. #1, because it's at such a steep angle that your hand can't go into its natural position. In order to use it, your hand needs to lay very flat, which is wrong. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm going to get into nib geometry. You don't want this problem. This creates, like I said, a hindrance for anyone learning calligraphy. It's not good. To me, it's an option if you have no other choice, but you're going to be limited on the nibs you can use. There's some nibs. I got a Leonard principle here. I think it will line properly. Let me make sure before I say that. It's pretty close. Again, a principle's off a little bit. It's too far to the right. You always want dead center or just a hair bit to the left. So unless I cram it in there, but no, it won't. So this is not helping anyone. So if you make something like this, you're not helping a soul out. So what I'm going to get into is making sure that this is right. When you're making a pen, I think both of these, let's see, there we go, this one comes out. Okay, there's this angle cut here. And in order to change your flange geometry, when you're putting this together, you want to just trim it down until it's the correct geometry. It's not a set angle, and I'll go into that in a minute why. Some people say, I've got mine set at a 55-degree angle. That may be the case if all your pens are identical in diameter, but there is no set positive angle for the nib, and we'll get into that in a minute. Like I said, the important thing is if you take a short nib, like this is like I think like a 355 Esterbrook, it's able to line up with, oh, perfect. This one holds it right in the center, so I'll be able to just leave this in there and use it for example. It's able to line up with the center axis or a little bit to the left, depending on your preference on that short nib. If you take a nib like the Principal, which I just crammed into this holder and now can't get out, let me grab a pair of pliers. A second. It's an old nib, so I always use old nibs for demonstration because I can tear them up. You can take a Principal and put it in this flange and push it in far enough and it will line up with center axis, as you can see. Oops, as you can see. You can take a long nib, and again, because this is an open-ended back flange, open-ended back metal flange, sorry, bend this a little bit, and I broke off my, but that's okay, we can show you just by holding it. And it too, push it in there, it will align properly. So that's the first thing. Now, if you get into a wide holder, we'll grab a big giant carrot to show you how this works. Flange geometry is based on the diameter of a pin holder. Okay? And by that, what I mean is you have a longitudinal axis of the pin that runs right down the center of each pin. And when you're placing it on a thin holder, let me use this to keep it out to the side. Basically what happens is it goes at a certain distance away from the center axis. If that distance increases, what happens is as it moves out, you can see it's also moving away from the center axis. So in order to compensate for that, as the diameter increases, you're actually going to bring the angle in. So this angle is not doesn't matter as long as number one, the nib is close to the holder. You don't want it floating way out here to begin with. You want it to get it up close. I put mine so, you know, the flange has about a 1/16 of an inch between the holder and the nib. And like I said, as that diameter increases, it's going to go out. So you just increase this angle in. I'm going to go dramatic, you know, as it goes farther out. So that's how the geometry is related to the diameter, because, you know, on a thin holder it's going to be very close, on a thick holder it's going to be further out. And in order to compensate that, you need to make sure that you bring that nib in the angle so it's able to meet that center axis of the holder, like so. And if you don't do that, what's going to happen is it's going to go, number one, farther away from center axis, but also in order to get it lined up, you're going to have to pull it further out of the flange. Let me put a flange back in a pin. Okay, so if this was to go out, you would have to, if it were a big wide pin, it was way out here and you needed to bring it closer to center axis, the only option you have at that point is to slide it out. Well, at that point you'd be way out here. Number one, your nib would be so far away from the end of your pin staff it would be almost unusable. And number two, it would only be hanging on a little edge on the back. So that's, again, as that diameter increases, tip this in. And the way that the end person accounts for that is you're typically writing with your paper at a, pretend this is a paper, 45-degree angle. Well, if this is a little bit steeper, you're just going to adjust the paper slightly, a couple degrees. Because, I mean, between this holder and this holder, you're only talking a couple degrees of difference, but that's a big enough difference to not have your nib in line with your lettering. So that's the first thing with geometry. So you want to get it close in, you want to get that so that any nib, no matter if it's short, medium, or long, is going to reach. The way that I do that, the way that I always have it, so a short nib works or a longer nib like a G nib works, is I use a Leonard principle. There's two reasons. Number one, it is a medium length nib. It's shorter than a G. It's longer than like a Browse 66 or these little mapping nibs like a Gillette 170 or Esterbrook 355. So when you're setting up your nib flange angle, I use a Leonard principle. And when I do it for consistency, and this also helps accuracy, I place the nib in so that you can see it come out the back there. I bring it in just a little bit, probably like an 1/16 of an inch or so in. And if I set it with that geometry, with that nib in there, and then I make my adjustments, cut my flange and place it in my slot and get it where I need it, I know that when I go to put a Nico G nib in this, it's going to line up. I know that when I put a little short nib in this, it's also going to line up because I use this medium length. And the other reason I use it is the principle has a medium arc. As you know, all pins have this is going to be difficult to show, have a different arc shape to them. This is a medium arc compared to a flatter nib or a very steep nib like a Nico G. So the Leonard principle is what I use for all my flanges. So every single flange I do is rough fit to a Leonard principle when it's done. From there, I'm able to adjust it easily using that. So that's your first thing is that flange angle is so important. You know, this is very basic geometry. It's lining up the very tip of something with the center axis. It's just changing that angle slightly to accommodate for the diameter. Make sure it lines up. If it doesn't line up, it doesn't do any good. My other pet peeve is nibs that are sticking out like that. I've seen it. There's two things happening when you do that. Number one, you're limiting the long nibs you can use because you're bringing that point out farther towards the center axis because it's at an angle. So there's no reason for all this extra overhang up here. To me, a pin should be, let me grab one that's, hold on one second. Grab a pin out of my box. If you look at this, this is one of my pins. It's my personal pin. The flange is right at the corner of that wood, and that allows room for both short and long nibs. It's cosmetically looks a little bit better in my opinion, but that's not the main reason I do it. I put it right at that edge. It's because of nib length variances. That's the kind of the center of where it's at. So the closer you can get it to that, the more accommodating it's going to be to different nibs. So, you know, all it takes is making that slot a little bit longer or drilling your hole a little bit deeper if you're doing a Zenarian mount like this, to slide that down just a little bit more. And then get your flange again right. That has to be absolutely correct. For this to work properly, the angle needs to be correct. You know, like I said in the beginning, it can be the prettiest pin, it can be the ugliest pin, it doesn't matter. As long as this flange geometry is right, you can put this on a tree branch and write with it, and it's going to write just as good as the prettiest pin you'd ever see. Okay, the second thing is engineering. And by that I mean, how's this pin going to last? Number one, you need to make sure that the wood that you're using is a hardwood. Hardwoods, softwoods can be used, but hardwoods are so much better because they're more resistant to changes in shape, bending, and everything. A softwood like pine, something like that, over time the tail can warp because it's more porous, and and more humidity and temperature can affect it. Secondly, it will be stronger at the end if it's a hardwood. You want to make sure that you're not just using a branch you found, because in the center of wood is a thing called a pith. In the very center of a branch, you always see this little dot area, and what that is the pith, and that's how the tree gets its nutrients. If you leave that pith in the wood, it's very porous. It's basically kind of like blood vessels for a tree of sorts. That's the best way to think about it. Is it's the blood vessels, and the fluids and everything's running back and forth between it primarily. So it's more porous, and what happens is as it dries, that pith dries at a very different rate than the heartwood, which is outside, or the sapwood, which is at the exterior of the tree. So that pith needs to be removed and cut out, because what will happen is it will dry out very fast. It will dry out at a different rate than the rest of the wood, and it will crack. So that's why when you see like an entire log that's been sitting out and the ends are all cracked up, it's because that pith is still in it and it's drying at a different rate and it's falling apart. So you want to make sure that the wood you have has no pith in it. It's cut out. The last thing is, think about, use your common sense. Is the wood protected from outside variables as much as possible? Is moisture and temperature not going to affect it very much? Temperature and moisture has a huge effect on wood. It can do all kinds of crazy things, so you've got to protect it from the environment. And by that, like for example, on my pens, I do a clear coat, which it's not 100%, but it keeps the moisture in. Anything you put on is going to be a tiny bit porous, but not like wood. The last thing is your foot. All these areas where your slit is or your hole is for the Zenarian, and the little slit that's right here, those are all areas where water can penetrate, moisture can penetrate, because you're sticking this in water and water-based ink all day. So seal these up. I have a couple things that I do on my pens extra, which helps wick material up into the wood to protect the foot, to make it last. But I'm also doing this on a commercial lifetime warranty type basis. So I'm going a little bit further than you would if you were making one for yourself. You can seal this little gap with CA. You can seal it with epoxy. You can do the same thing up here. You just want to keep water from penetrating the wood of the pen. Again, on the end of the foot here, you want to seal it as well, because that's the end grain of the wood. And if you picture wood, if you look at it microscopically at the end here, what this is a bunch of little tubes. It looks like hundreds of thousands of little straws. And water, when it touches it, it will absorb up into the wood. So what happens is, over time, after more and more water, all it takes is one drop, and you've already started adding water to this. And after many, many years, this will become soft. This can crack. It can deteriorate. It can just become worthless and fall apart and break. I've got many, many vintage pens in my collection with a Zenarian mouth where they were just stuck in there, and of course they were slinging ink like it was nothing, so they weren't as careful as we are today, I'm sure. But they've split apart, they've swollen, the flanges fall out, and it's all because of water penetration over many, many, many years going up into this foot of the pen and ruining the wood. So you want to seal it all. The next thing is, you're segmenting. And I covered this in another video before a little bit, touched on it. Where you segment two materials together, they need to stay, if you do that. And by segmenting, I mean you take a wood, you glue it to another wood, and glue it to another, like on this. This has several different woods all glued together. And then through the center of it is a wooden dowel, and that helps support it, because the end grain of wood, these porous cavities on the end of a pen, don't like to take glue like a solid surface does, so you have to dowel it to increase that strength. And you want light materials, and the reason is because of expansion and contraction. Basically, if you look at it and you we'll look at these two boxes of nibs as two different types of materials. Let's say this is wood and this is wood. Well, as things expand and contract, wood does. These are both going to expand and contract at the same rate. So, you're wanting to make sure that these are able to stay together. If, say this was a plastic and this was a wood, here's what's going to happen is, as temperature and humidity affects it, they're going to slightly shift. And we're doing this on a very small level. We're talking, you know, hundredths of an inch, maybe into tenths of an inch, but I very seriously doubt it. And over time, they're going to move back and forth and back and forth and back and forth with all these variables in temperature. And what's going to happen is that glue bond is going to break. And the first thing that happens is, you'll notice is, and you're not going to have it on this pin, is a ridge is going to develop at this point where they meet. So it's good to use same materials, and by that I mean if you're doing a wood pen, use wood for the whole thing. If you're doing an acrylic pen, do acrylic for the whole thing, because they're two materials that together they're going to expand and contract at the same rate if they're used with the same like materials. Use them with different and it's going to end up falling apart. That falling apart could happen in a matter of years, a couple years. Say for example, I'm pulling numbers out. If your environment you're in varies a lot. You know, if you go from like 20% humidity to 100% humidity back and forth and back and forth and back and forth all the time, it's going to be detrimental if it's not like materials. If you're in a very stable environment, it could last and stay glued forever. That's possible. It's just, you want to think about, someone's going to spend a decent amount of money. You know, it's $150 is common nowadays for a pin holder, custom. And if I was spending $150, I want this thing to last. I want it to last, you know, it'd be nice if it lasted the rest of my lifetime. So you're wanting to do everything you can to make that last. You know, you look at today, you know, there's these old vintage pins or heirlooms. I'm hoping that in the future, you know, the ones that we're all doing today are going to become that next generation of heirlooms. And if they're not staying together, they're not going to be that heirloom. They're going to be thrown away. So there you have it. Beyond that, you know, you get that flange geometry right, you get the engineering right on it, and make sure that you do everything that common sense tells you you should to make that thing last. Beyond that, do whatever you want, any shape, any size, any whatever. I mean, your preferences are all over the place. You know, people like big giant carrots, people like tiny little skinny pins. You know, it's all over the place, and that's all a matter of personal preference, in my opinion. You know, there's some that say that you have to have a specific size, but I don't believe in that. I think everyone's hands are different, everyone's sizes are different. The styles are not like they used to be, where there was just a couple of styles to choose from and you did that and you did it by the rules and that was the end of story. So it's all over the place now, and you just want to get the geometry right so it's a usable tool. Beyond that, make it as pretty as you possibly can, you know, and hopefully you'll do everything you can and it'll last for many, many, many years and be around for forever. So there's my soapbox on making sure you're doing everything right. So if you have any questions, everybody knows my email. My email is on my website, www.yokepincompany.com. You can find it there and get in contact with me. I help anyone out that contacts me. So there you have it. Okay, thank you.